the uncomfortable truth is that nobody knows what tactical training is. Like at this point, it's so young, and the system is currently being flooded by folks coming from so many different places. And this from like a coaching standpoint, that right now, if you asked, any coach what tactical strength and conditioning is, they probably just piece together stuff that they took from the sports that they came from. So for some companies, and I've seen this in real time, the sister squadron to the one I used to work at in the Air Force went through, in a period of probably 2 years, went through 3 or 4 different strength coaches that came from 3 or 4 different backgrounds. One from football, and while he was there, he trained them like football players. The one that came after him came from the NBA, and they all of a sudden were doing a lot of NBA type training, and then on and on and on.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 5 of the Mops and Mo's podcast. I'm Alex.
I'm your co-pilot, Drew.
Today we'll be talking about something it seems like almost every brigade across the Army is mandated at least once a week: tactical physical training, and what the heck that might even mean, because we sure don't know what it means, but we'll try and figure it out in this episode.
We're basically diving into a conversation around whether or not training with a weight vest and or kit and or ruck makes you a tactical athlete or not.
It's all about what you wear. It's the only important thing.
Basically what it boils down to, I think. That's as far as we get.
Gotta look cool. All right, let's go.
Buckle up. I was saying, because I used to tell dudes all the time, what's the difference between rucking and hiking? Because it's like, oh, I'm going to go for a ruck. It's like, what's the difference? In the civilian, we always call it a hike. I'm like, well, it's because I've got boots on. There's no difference between the two things.
That was one of the biggest perks of being at Fort Carson was,
for sure.
like, if we had to do rucking stuff, it was going to be off post and it was going to be in the mountains, and it was amazing.
It's going to be hiking is essentially.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was civilian clothes. We didn't actually even mandate that they had to wear their Army ruck, so people would show up with like whatever backpack. It was amazing. It was literally just hiking, and then we go out for breakfast afterwards.
That's my point. So I had to, like, for programming for dudes, I will program and I will write the word hike if psychologically I don't want them to get into this like selection mindset of like, I'm freaking Navy SEAL now because I'm rucking. Because when you say ruck, people get into this like heightened state of whatever, because it's all of a sudden tactical.
But I think what we're getting at here is what makes strength and conditioning, tactical strength and conditioning, is the outfit. It's not the program design. It's not the exercises. It's none of that stuff. It's whether you're wearing something camouflage when you do it.
And a Punisher skull. And what you're listening to. So the topic of tonight's discussion is you hit on it already, what makes training tactical. That's the most open-ended. This is probably the most open-ended topic we've just thrown down.
Yeah, it's dangerously like a lot of rabbit holes in this space. Don't know exactly what direction it's going to go, but that's kind of the whole design here, is that we don't actually have a plan for this episode.
I'll kick it off because from like an organization of training standpoint, I would envision this, or I guess I do envision this as a triangle or a pyramid, if you will, where the top of the pyramid, and you see this a lot in basically any sport, this same kind of visual, where the top is like your specificity piece, and you spend the least amount of time doing that because you've developed everything else, which is your base. And I'm sure we'll dive into the different pieces of that. But the tactical part of it, I think, the tip of the spear, to use a horrible cliche, the top of the pyramid is the most bastardized and overdone element of tactical training that there is. And if I could change one thing about tactical strength and conditioning, it would be the mental shift around just because you carry a gun around and wear camouflage and LARP for a living does not mean that you need to be farting around with sandbags every single day and doing Murph just because it's tactical. Sorry, I'm on my soapbox. My rant is over. That's me laying the foundation for this conversation.
I think there's probably going to be a few rants in this episode. The thought I had bouncing around in my head. So like, this is very similar to a discussion of like what makes functional fitness functional. I think they're both kind of the same discussion. And where I kind of land on the functional fitness thing is that it's more of a marketing term than something that like describes any particular kind of training. Because like people argue that like functional fitness is just fitness that carries over to the things you're doing, but that's just well-programmed training of any kind, right? Or really training of any kind. Because like depending on what the outcome you're looking for is, it's really hard to describe some area where you got more fit and it didn't make you somehow better at the thing. Like there's not a way that like a certain kind of, I mean, with like rare exceptions of like gaining a ton of mass and trying to run a marathon or something, in almost every case, being a little bit fitter is probably going to make you better at the thing. So I think we get carried away on trying to make training look tactical or trying to make training look functional, like looking tactical being like wearing a vest or wearing combat uniform or whatever it is, and looking functional being like there's turf on the floor instead of like regular gym flooring. Like that's literally the whole thing. But the training is still like the exact same principles apply. I think a big piece of it is that, and like this varies, but in general, there are far fewer physically demanding jobs today than there were. Like percentage of the population engaged in physically demanding jobs is a lot lower, and the tactical professionals are a subset that like persists. Like even if you're in a big city where a lot of people work kind of office jobs and things like that, there are still tactical professionals doing jobs that have pretty significant physical demands associated with them. And so that's all it really is that the world's getting more sedentary and we have to maintain it for this population.
Sound like John F. Kennedy.
Uh-oh.
Yes, I think a good analogy, metaphor, comparison that I've used in the past. So like football, American football and or soccer. If we look at the literature around these sports, soccer is actually probably a better one because you'll see a ton of stuff on what they call small-sided games, which is essentially like what are the physiological demands of 3-on-3 versus 7-on-7 versus 10-on-10 versus 11, and they'll scale up and down based on where you're at in the season or what kind of outcomes you want as a snapshot of the game, so to speak. But they're not, you won't see situations where they're trying to replicate the sport in the gym. And I think where the tactical training thing kind of goes awry is that for lack of really knowing what else to do, coaches and athletes in this space will just come up with like, we'll call it a wad for lack of a better term, and they'll throw a weight vest on, and then all of a sudden that's tactical. But just saying that it simulates combat doesn't, for me, cover it, because it doesn't simulate combat at all. You're just making someone really tired, and they happen to be doing it in the uniform that they also work in. So I would say that, and I mean, I did this for a while working with the Air Force, trying to replicate the field in the gym, because that's sort of what you do in sport. But depending on the ops tempo of the group you're working with, chances are they're probably getting enough touches on their quote unquote sport by going out in the field and actually doing their job, whether that's going to the range or doing med lanes or, working artillery, what have you. Like that's their sport. So in order to prepare them for that, the fundamentals are the same, regardless of the MOS or, the branch or what have you. Like you still need your aerobic base. You still need your basic foundation of strength. So you could argue that that is tactical training. It's just training in a tactical environment as opposed to Murph. I keep coming back to Murph for some reason. I should probably come up with a different.
Well, I think a point you made there is key, because it does depend on the population you're working with, because not all tactical professionals do get a ton of touches on the actual tactical work, but they're all still at some point asked to perform that stuff. So I think like your brigade right now is probably a good example. But I think just my experience coming from even an infantry battalion, right? In an infantry battalion, most of the guys get a lot of touches, but not all of them. And I was on staff for a while, right? So we have a lot of guys who, for many months of a training cycle, are mostly behind a desk in a building, not doing anything terribly tactical. And then you chuck them out there for whatever training exercise it is and expect them to be ready to go. There is like a legitimate argument in that case that you do need to look at things like just like tissue tolerance, like having your skin not immediately become a huge issue because you haven't rucked in boots in a long time, or you haven't worn kit in a long time. Like that matters. Or like I saw a lot of value in occasionally doing stuff in body armor just to make sure people's body armor fit. Right. Like it's a great way, like doing a workout in body armor, we'll find out real fast whose stuff fits well, whose stuff is adjusted well to them. And there is value to that. And like maybe that says something about how we're allocating our training time for soldiers and tactical professionals. Like maybe we're not doing a good enough job of actual job training, but there probably is a place maybe during PT hours to get after some of that. And that's like, we've ripped a lot on just like saying it's tactical because you're wearing a certain outfit, but sometimes you might want to do training in that outfit for good reasons.
No, that's true. I've done pre-deployment type stuff. I've had guys do workouts in their kit, and it actually has been valuable because, like you said, they realize, oh, this doesn't feel right there. That needs to be tightened down there. Blah 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 blah. I've also taken like assault bikes out to the range, and kettlebells and that sort of stuff, and played around with the idea of like, what does systemic fatigue do to marksmanship versus localized fatigue? So like assault bike intervals being systemic and like kettlebell swings being more localized, and how does that affect fatigue? But that, in my mind, is markedly different than what we typically will see in this space, which is, I mean, not to knock CrossFit, I like CrossFit, but CrossFit, like the idea of taking an assault bike to the range to create an effect, to elicit a response, is deliberate and there's purpose to it, versus foregoing a long easy run in favor of doing some heinousness with a weight vest on because it feels like Rambo. So my big knock against tactical training, in the sense that we're sort of talking about it, is that because we've already touched on this idea of not having a ton of time available to train, so every training minute is very valuable. And I think there's a lot of folks, and you'll see it as you walk around any installation, there's a lot of folks that would take more value from just doing basic fundamental stuff versus following whatever the NCO decided. And I've seen this on a daily basis. Somebody pulls out a deck of cards and it's like, that's the workout today. Like every time you see an ace, you've got to do burpees. It's like, really, that's where we're at right now. But sometimes there's fun in that. So is it bad? I don't know.
I get triggered by the deck of cards.
I did see it. I'll be honest. And it happens across the street from my office, so I see it all the time.
It frustrates me just because, like, kind of the theme we're getting at here is like, just have a reason why you're doing the training you're doing, and the deck of cards workout just reeks of purely random. And like there is a case to be made that, like, in most cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases, people could benefit from just doing a little bit more, like more stuff, more activity, more training. But like you said, we have limited time. We have to treat our time like it's valuable, and just doing random stuff. Like you wouldn't go to the field to do a deck of cards field exercise, right? Like you wouldn't say like, if we get an ace, we're going to do like buddy team live fire this week, whatever. Or if we get like a king, it's going to be win your danger area. Like you like, we treat the actual training, like the tactical training, the job training we do, with some like respect and like deliberate planning and things like that. And I think the physical training we do deserves the same. And I kind of harp on this a lot, but it's kind of absurd that, and like speaking from the Army here, trying to like open this up to more tactical professions than just the Army and just the active duty. But I think it's a little bit ridiculous that training that we commit 5 to 8 hours to per week receives so little, like, quote unquote mission analysis, or like, why are we doing this and what's the goal? Like, go to a unit and say, what is the goal of the physical training you're doing? And a lot of them will either, it'll just be the PT test, or they'll have no idea what you're talking about. Like, what do you mean goal? We're here to just do some exercise. Cool.
No, it's to increase lethality. I've heard that one more times than I care to count. I'm like, all right, you're so much more lethal because you just did, XYZ. I mean, having never been in the military, but having worked for the military my whole career, the thing that I always laugh about is on every shirt, it's something to do with the number one priority is like people first or physical training or blah, 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 blah. But to your point, like, it is generally, of all the, mission critical skills, it is the least analyzed and the least, because I think people just assume like there's so many resources. And I mean, as a strength coach, I see this all the time. There's so many resources that surely surely whoever is the fittest knows how to do it the best. That usually leads you down, and we see this with H2F specifically, where, the NCO of the day likes running. So you ran yesterday, you did an ACFT today, tomorrow you're rucking, and then the next day you come in because you have a foot injury. It's like, well, I could have told you that was going to happen if you came in last week and said that this is what you're going to do. So,
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily know how we solve some of it. I do think there's an argument. I've been talking to a couple of people about this recently. Like, what adaptations are we really looking for with tactical professionals broadly and with soldiers specifically? And I think like making people able to tolerate more volume, like more volume of activity, more load, is pretty critical, because like you don't know what they're going to be asked to do.
does this mean that you're telling me that tactical athletes are endurance athletes?
I don't want to go all the way down that rabbit hole. We already did it. We did talk about this, but
literally said that they just need to tolerate more volume. That is an endurance adaptation. Just gonna leave that.
It absolutely is. And I think what's cool there, and like where we benefit, is that, and like you can tell me more because you have more of an academic background in this than I do, but from my limited perspective, it seems like the ceiling on tolerance for volume is like astronomically higher than the ceiling on tolerance for intensity. Like you start running into diminishing returns pretty fast if you're training somebody to like be able to perform at higher intensities or like lift heavier weights or whatever it is. Like you're gonna, that curve is gonna get shallower really fast. Whereas if you are like slow and steady with your approach to increasing volume, you can kind of keep on increasing volume to a pretty significant degree. Like you might not get a ton faster or a ton stronger, but you can do a lot more without suffering negative consequences.
Well, yeah, basically, which I think is kind of a misconception around training in general, because intensity feels good in a weird way, because intensity is what puts you on the ground. It's what makes your muscles sore. Like it's what puts weight on the bar. Like it's very visceral. Volume is more of a patience game, and it takes time, which sounds a little bit esoteric, but like volume tolerance, I think if we had to really drill this down, like you said, and what is the most fundamental requirement for an effective tactical athlete, it's volume tolerance. And that's not even tactical athletes. I mean, that's any athlete. Think of an NFL player, like the guy that can handle more hits and can get up and can get more minutes in practice, and more minutes equals more skill refinement, it equals more touches, it equals more whatever, and that translates to more, like it's all volume tolerance. So you'll see different analogies. You'll see like, volume is like the size of the knife and intensity is sharpening it. Or volume is sand and intensity is water, and you have to have the right mix to make a sandcastle and blah 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 blah. But yeah, I think that, kind of to echo what you said, the ability to just do more work is better than the ability to do hard work less frequently.
Yeah. And I think what we run into though is like the idea that you need to tolerate a lot of volume can lead people to just like training really high volume, which is correlated with injury, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to get smart about how we how we progress into it. And I don't know if you've read it, I've been nerding out the last couple of weeks about the Olympic Committee's consensus statement on like load and injury risk, because I've got like a few mops and mo's posts coming on that. I was going to do it all as one, but I realized it's like way too much nerding out for like one thing. I'm gonna have to break it into like four. But just for the people listening, to summarize it, it's the title is How Much is Too Much? And the answer is there isn't really such a thing as too much, but there definitely is such a thing as too much too soon. And it's all about progressing load gradually, because yes, like high training loads are associated with injury risk. There's just as good evidence that the athletes who train at the highest volumes are less susceptible to injury. It's like, why is there that paradox? It's because they progressed gradually to get there. People who try and ramp up too quickly are the ones who are getting hurt. And that's where we need to figure out, how do we get people to plan their training deliberately? Because like the report gets into like, you need a weekly load, and that includes both training and everything else. So like other stressors and competitions and whatever, but you want a weekly load that's within 0.8 to 1.3 of your 4-week rolling average of load, which basically means you can increase by, like if you're increasing by more than 20% in a week to week basis, you're running a serious risk of injury. So you have to progress slowly, which means you have to have a plan. You have to know how much volume you're at right now and how much you can increase that by. And you don't get that with decks of cards and random Murphs, right? You have to, like Murph, if you train up for it, is not that bad. Like there are a lot of athletes who are prepared for it, who could do Murph and then like continue working out the next day because it's just a workout and they were ready for it. But if you don't practice high volume of those exercises, Murph is going to ruin you for like 3 days because you didn't progress into it. You just threw a huge amount of volume at yourself. And that's the issue. You just need to plan a little better.
Yeah, I'm trying to like avoid going down this rabbit hole of how to construct a tactical training plan, because that just creates a whole conversation. But I mean, yeah, it basically starts with like, you have to be on, if I'm dealing with a singular athlete, or if I am that singular athlete, you have to do an honest self-assessment of like where you're at currently and what your current volume looks like, current intensity. And then, you know, I've probably said this before, like instead of taking that and then mapping out the next 12 weeks, it's taking that and then adding a little bit and doing it and seeing how you respond, and then adding a little bit and doing it and seeing how you respond, and then adding a little bit and doing it, and just over and over and over and over and over. So you get this like iterative program. And within that, like if you do find, I know we've been knocking on like Murph and decks of cards and stuff, like if you find, which I would, you know, call that like work capacity. So if you find that that's something that one, you enjoy, but more importantly two, has like a positive benefit on the rest of your fitness, then there's nothing that says you can't add some of that. But if you find that it starts to take away from your progression, then maybe, you know, switch it up. I think the big thing, and tactically probably more important than otherwise because there's so much chaos in the system, but the big thing is just having something in place that allows you to collect information from your training plan. And I think that that's something that is sorely missing in every single tactical strength and conditioning plan, is that there is no mechanism for feedback. Like, I don't necessarily think that NFL coaches or NBA coaches have that either, but what they do have is a game on a weekend where they can see if what they're doing is paying dividends, because if it's not, then people are getting injured or you're losing or whatever. Like that doesn't exist in this space. So you have to create those mechanisms yourself, which again opens up a series of different rabbit holes about what that looks like. But to your point, if you're just going out and doing stuff and there's no way for you to like debrief it the way that you would a full mission profile, I mean, then you're not really, you're just farting around for 2 hours and working out. Like you're not training.
I think, and this is like objective versus subjective measures of load is stuff we've talked about before, but I think it's easy to write off the monitoring thing saying like in pro athletics or like elite settings, they have access to all these tools that we don't have, right? Like they'll put monitors on athletes. They'll put monitors on athletes that like tell you how many meters they covered during like a practice session or a game, and like how many times they accelerated and how much they accelerated, and all that stuff can be distilled down into a nice objective measure of load, or you can put like various wearables on them to track heart rate variability and whatever it is. There's lots of ways to objectively monitor different kinds of loads. But the nice thing is, like, the research is showing more and more that not only are subjective measures just as decent, they may actually be better in a ton of cases. So like, it sounds cheesy to like have people do surveys before each workout of like, how rested do you feel, or how ready do you feel this workout, or how sore do you feel, and all those things. But those are validated ways to keep track of how people are responding to your program. Like, if you notice a dramatic uptick of people being like much more sore this week, you probably added in a little bit too much, a little bit too soon. Like, it's not necessarily sustainable, and you're going to start running into injury risk. Like, monitoring things as simply as that can set you up for success in like better managing the amount of training or the type of training that you're doing. It's just so you can respond, like, just so you're tracking how your soldiers or your athletes or your tactical professionals or whoever are responding to the training you're putting them through.
Well, and what's frustrating is that exists whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Like, the fact that, so I'll use RPE as an example. Like, RPE for a set of squats, all it is you asking the athlete to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. So whether they do that or not, that subjective level of effort exists. All it takes is you acknowledging it and then telling them to give it to you. And it's going to be rough at first. Like, they're probably off. That's fine. So, I'll introduce it by having, maybe you do prescribe percentages or whatever, and you just have them attach a level of effort to that. And then over time, the level of effort begins to be what dictates the loading. And ipso facto, you've created a monitoring, system within your training. But I do think people get freaked out by this idea of like so many metrics and analytics. And actually, this is quite timely. I was listening to a podcast today with Mike Tashir, which, if anyone's familiar, is the guy that introduced RPE to powerlifting. And he was talking about the same sort of thing through the lens of like the cockpit of an airplane, where if you look at it, there's buttons literally all over the place. And to the untrained eye, you would think, how could anyone ever fly this thing? Like, you'd have to be a freak to monitor all this stuff. But realistically, you're only monitoring like 3 or 4 things. And if you look at the dashboard on your car while you're driving, like, you're not messing with the AC or flipping on the 4-wheel drive or do it, like, all these different things. Training is the same way. Like, just because all of these things exist, wearables and cameras and velocity trackers and heart rate variability, at the end of the day, just asking the athlete, how do you feel going into the session? How do you feel coming out of the session? What did you do yesterday? What do you have planned later? Like, that's enough information to probably make adequate changes to adapt to the individual. So I don't know. I mean, we're getting away from like the tactical thing. I don't know if that makes it tactical or not, but this idea of being open to adjusting stuff because there's so much else going on, training, jumping out of airplanes, having appointments at the hospital that take 4 days. You have to have that stuff in place so that you can account for all those demands.
So in an attempt to right this ship in terms of getting back to talking about what makes tactical strength and conditioning tactical,
just for camo,
I think something we're kind of like circling around is, if we had to distill out like something that's unique about the field of tactical strength and conditioning, or the setting of tactical strength and conditioning, it might just be the degree of chaos, right? So one, you are unlikely to know the physical demands of the task they're going to be put into, right? Like, combat is different every time. We have no idea. Sometimes like artillery units deploy as light infantry, and you may have trained them for the totally wrong task. And then just the chaos of the day to day, which is like the randomness of like when people come and go from the organization, when like training steps on your plan, or like not necessarily having an awareness of the physical demands of the training they're doing outside of PT. Just there's a lot of variables that are very, very hard to control. So you need to be like flexible and adaptable enough to respond to them. And that's why I think it's appropriate that a conversation about what makes tactical strength and conditioning tactical turns to, how do we monitor load in an environment that's a little bit unpredictable like that, right? Because we're never going to have like a full understanding of what they're doing day to day. We're rarely going to have even 2 weeks of visibility into the future of what the calendar looks like. So I think having like a good understanding of how to utilize those subjective measures or objective measures, if you have the ability to do that, to keep track of how your training is affecting people, it's going to be pretty critical, because you need to be adapting your training to all of those things that are going on.
Well, and the other thing I would add to that is, and this is just from my experience, so working in, like when I was doing graduate work and dealing with more of like your typical collegiate athlete that has a rigid schedule and everything is kind of planned out, like they don't require the same level of like self-awareness around the training as what I came to realize is required in a tactical setting. Like you can just give them a plan and they'll follow it because they follow. I mean, that's their job, is to basically do what they're told. Not in a negative way, but with tactical athletes, the athlete is required to be bought into the training plan. They're required to know what's going on. They're required to have some degree of the same tools as the person who writes the plan, because at the end of the day, like you said, they may deploy and not have the coach. They may be offsite training and not have equipment. And if they don't know the foundation of the thing that they're doing, then they're not going to have the tools or, the skills to necessarily change that, to adapt to the environment that they're in while still staying on track. Because yes, there's an element of chaos, I would say, in tactical training, but it's like directed chaos. It's not randomness. And I think that there's a difference there. So even getting into conversations around like work capacity, which I think is a unique aspect of tactical training. Like there's a difference in deliberate work capacity and like work out of the day, and being able to put constraints around that so that what you're doing makes sense. And it's not just the deck of cards thing, is I think one of those things that makes tactical training different from traditional sports training.
I think this also like brushes up against the topic, which I know a lot of people in our space are dealing with right now, is like the transition, or like what is different about being a coach in tactical versus being a coach in more traditional strength and conditioning settings.
Oh, yes.
And being able to prepare people for that. And it's a little bit buzzwordy, but the phrase I like a lot is creating autonomous athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Coaches in a tactical environment have to do, I think, I haven't spent as much time in traditional strength and conditioning environments, obviously, but I think there's more expected of them in terms of their ability to communicate and their ability to teach this stuff, because they're not going to be there as consistently. You can't, like, your space that you're responsible for is not just like the weight room you're in with the 10 squat racks and like the athletes at each one, where you get to hand them their little printout and make sure they do the things that it says, and you're there to monitor everything. That's not realistic in terms of the ratio you're going to experience. And the same kind of thing applies if you're in a unit that doesn't have professionals to run this stuff. Like you have to be taking ownership of the why behind it and the understanding of how the whole thing works, so that you can function autonomously and still run good training even when the resources aren't right there to guide you.
Yeah, I think, this is probably a really cheesy analogy, but to me, like especially talking about, which to be honest could probably be its own podcast, transitioning from sport coaching to tactical coaching. But the analogy that comes to mind is like in a sports setting, you're more of a conductor. Like you're managing this weight room, and they come in, there's like a warm-up group, they get their sheet, they do their thing, they shuffle out, rinse and repeat, because this next sport is coming up. Like you're conducting the orchestra. In a tactical setting, you're more of a guide than anything. Well, at least if you're doing your job correctly, you're more of a guide, because again, like there is no selection bias towards a particular body type or particular physiology, or like you're going to deal with so many different types of people with so many different backgrounds. And like, while you will have that in sport, we are at such a high level of sport now where you're starting to see selection bias towards particular archetypes. And whether you realize it or not, that generally means that the training that you're able to create will be effective for everyone that you administer it to. In this setting, tactical setting, that's not necessarily the case, because you have people that are, 7 feet tall and 5 feet tall on the same team. So if you try to just do like a quote unquote team program, you're going to miss the boat on a lot of folks and you're opening them up to injury. So again, to your point, like the job of the coach is less about, am I going to give them 5 reps or 7 reps, and more about, what does the athlete feel about this training? Are they bought in? Like, do they like it? Do they like me? Do they like the weight room? What, that sort of, so, I mean, there's a bajillion different things you have to deal with, but it's less about, which is interesting because people that are younger in this field or people that are new to this field always ask the question about what reps do, what exercises, what does the training week look like? And none of that to me is as important as, do your athletes like you? Because if they don't, your program is not mandatory and they just won't do it. And chances are their company commander, battalion commander, squadron commander doesn't care that they don't like you. They're not going to make them do it. So again, one of those things that, like, when you step into that weight room for the first time in a tactical setting, it's a little bit eye-opening how different it can be.
I think so. Like, to set this up, I'm a huge Ted Lasso fan, but I think part of it, like, to draw another analogy, I like the conductor one, but it's kind of the difference between coaching American football and coaching soccer. Whereas when you're coaching American football, like, the coach gets to make a decision on every play and like has some opportunity to like tell them what to do every single time, right? Whereas with soccer, the coach's work is done when they're going to the game, right? Like the coach doesn't do a hell of a lot during an actual game. He's going to trust that the stuff he's taught them leads them to make the right decisions and employ the plays they've walked through and things like that. Cause he can't stop and reset them and tell them to do something different. They're going to do what they've been taught how to do. And it's hands off from the coach at that point. And I think that parallels pretty closely here. Cause like coaches, if you're working in a tactical environment, and the only time you're influencing how the people you're coaching are training and behaving is when they're physically there with you, you're not having a lot of impact, right? Like even in really well-staffed special operations units, you're not touching these guys enough for that to be effective. You have to win them over to a way of doing things that they can take with them and continue to execute on, even when you're not there. You cannot rely on just walking them through something. And that's legitimately a paradigm shift that people are not, like, I don't think we do a good enough job of communicating the expectations of that when we bring people on board. And like, even the flip side, when you talk about units that don't have any kind of human performance staff, I don't think we spend enough time teaching the NCOs who lead physical training how to do it in any kind of evidence-based way, right? Like, there's PT is NCO business. And if that's the case, we owe them some education on this stuff, and we don't provide a whole lot of it. People know that, like, I spent a couple of years doing the Master Fitness Trainer course, and I think that name is pretty ironic because for most of the people who came to that course, it was their first time being exposed to like any kind of formal instruction on how to lead physical training. And it's ridiculous that like the masters are the ones who've learned anything at all, right? That means everybody else who's out there doing it has received basically only training on the drill and ceremony aspect of it, right? They know like which exercises are counted at which tempo, right? And they know the order of the exercises in the prep drill and all this stuff, but they haven't been taught anything about what volume is. Like, they don't know the concept. So how can we expect them to design and lead programs that account for like gradually progressing volume if we haven't taught them what volume or progression are, or how to measure any of those things, right? We're sending people out there to do something they haven't been trained on how to do.
You talk about like labels. When I started working with the Army, I didn't realize that battalion surgeon, brigade surgeon, those people aren't necessarily surgeons.
Yeah.
Just as an aside, especially working in a medical brigade, I was like, oh, that person's a surgeon. Nah, that's a nurse. That blew my mind. It's like the whole world is fake. Everything's a lie. But yes, to get back, like, I think the uncomfortable truth is that nobody knows what tactical training is. Like, at this point, it's so young, and the system is currently being flooded by folks coming from so many different places. And this, from like a coaching standpoint, that right now, if you asked, any coach what tactical strength and conditioning is, they probably just piece together stuff that they took from the sports that they came from. So for some companies, and I've seen this in real time, the sister squadron to the one I used to work at in the Air Force went through, in a period of probably 2 years, went through 3 or 4 different strength coaches that came from 3 or 4 different backgrounds, one from football. And while he was there, he trained them like football players. The one that came after him came from the NBA, and they all of a sudden were doing a lot of NBA type training, and then on and on and on. And I mean, some of that stuff may be effective, but like, it's all about paradigms. And like, if your bubble of thought is powerlifting, you're going to have a hard time justifying why a tactical athlete needs to run. Similarly, if your background is in track and field, strength training for you, for a tactical athlete, might be large numbers of sets and reps with really light weight, because to you, that's so. Again, like, it hasn't been around long enough for anyone to have created a paradigm of what tactical training is, the same way you might have a paradigm of what football strength and conditioning is, or basketball strength and conditioning, because those best practices over the last 30, 40 years have sort of risen to the top. And I don't think we've seen that yet in the tactical space, which is why there's so much, freedom to do stupid shit like deck of cards or, random workouts, because no one has really come up and said, maybe it look like this, and this, and here's the tools for the toolbox.
I do think I was starting to think, because I was going to say something about we have mechanisms for the best practices to rise to the top, right? Like, why don't we look to like some of the elite soft organizations with like the most physically demanding tasks and the biggest human performance staffs? But that comes back to what you were talking about earlier with like selection bias in who your people are. If all of those programs only have to train people who have already made it through selections that require huge amounts of tolerance for volume and baseline levels of strength and endurance and things like that, then like their programs can look really good because they only have to train people that already met all these requirements. So I don't know.
Well, even, I mean, like, not to get into the weeds with that type of stuff, but even in that case, and some of this, again, like, we'll dive deep for a second. Like, right now, tactical human performance from a professional standpoint is being handled by contracts, regardless of what level you're at, whether it's your basic, medical brigade or your most elite soft unit. It's all contractual or contract. So basically what that means is the barrier to entry across the board is the same, regardless of the population you're dealing with, because again, we haven't necessarily done a needs analysis, a professionalized needs analysis of the different facets of the force. So you'll go to these elite soft units, and the question I always ask is like, what's, it's not about what equipment you have or how much money you've spent, because to be honest, historically, what equipment you have and how much money you've spent have been the measuring posts for success in human performance tactically. But the question that should be being asked is, what's utilization look like? Because, to your point, like, you would assume that if I'm at this elite organization, then what these guys are doing, this is what elite looks like. But most of those guys aren't listening to what their strength coach says. And it's not a knock on their strength coach. It's just a situation where their strength coach, just by virtue of the way that the industry is set up, was pulled from an NFL team or an NBA team or a college. And as a result of that, they're dumping what they know, which is college or NFL or NBA, into the system of what they think these guys should be doing. And you ask most of these dudes what they think they should be doing, generally they think that tactically they're pretty well taken care of by virtue of the fact that they've made it to wherever they're at. Like, running and gunning and kicking indoors, like, they're good at that. They don't want to train like linebackers. They want to do an Ironman, or they want to do a powerlifting meet, or they want to go hike or climb. Like, they have, most like operational type dudes are more interested in training for their special interests than they are for their mission, simply because the mission has not yet been broken apart so much so that we've identified a need for doing any sort of gym-based training, which is a little bit of a rant / soapbox / just observation on the career field as a whole. But I think, to sort of put a bow on that, one of the hardest things about tactical strength conditioning, which we sort of already talked about, is that there is no objective benchmark to say, if you can do these tests, and we see this with the ACFT, the chaos around that. Like, if you can do these tests, then you will be good at war. Like, that doesn't exist at the same level that it does for, say, the NFL Combine or any of those types of events where there is enough data and there is enough objectivity to say, if your 40 is slower than this, you're probably not going to be a good wide receiver. Like, that doesn't exist for tactical people. So to try to convince them to train a certain way because you as the coach think that that's the right way to train is always a hard sell, because ultimately there's 10 of their other teammates that aren't training with you that are doing just fine when they deploy.
Well, it sounds like
It's my rant over.
yeah. We said at the beginning that there were probably going to be a few rants in this episode. It's a rant worthy topic, and I think we're drawing somewhat closer to a conclusion without necessarily like answering the question we started off with in the first place. But it seems like the general answer is there's not yet a clear definition of what tactical strength and conditioning means, or like why it is distinct from strength and conditioning in general. But we have figured out some useful principles for how to do it a little bit better. And most of that revolves around on like maybe focus more on general physical preparedness than you are on like some concept of sport specificity when you still can't really articulate the goal very well.
Yeah, and I think to be very, very practical and tangible with it, I think the correct way to go about doing it is take the best of strength training. So whether that's, Olympic lifting, whatever, but like powerlifting, the best of that, the best of the endurance world, the best of, and this makes some people uncomfortable, but the best of the CrossFit, functional fitness, work capacity world. Those are probably your big 3 pillars. And then the next question is then, okay, how do we combine those in such a way that we aren't overtraining, we aren't pushing people too hard, we're still taking into account the other things we talked about, like getting sucked out to do a mission or deploying or not having equipment. But if you can build a solid foundation of strength, a solid foundation of endurance, and then this other sort of third one, which is a solid foundation of work capacity, then I think you've got a pretty good foundation of tactical training that you can layer your mission critical skills on top of, instead of trying to turn your mission critical skills into gym-based events ultimately, which is where I think a lot of people go wrong.
Yeah, I buy that. That's a pretty good wrap up of how to do tactical strength conditioning.
I guess we could have said that at the beginning and made this like a 30-second podcast.
Well, that's not the point. We got to get people to listen and have cool conversations about load tolerance and how to transition careers and stuff.
Yeah. So we honestly, what we probably did here is just uncovered 5 or 6 more episodes that we should probably talk about.
That is pretty much what we did. Absolutely.
In business.
Hey, perfect.
All right. That's everything I have.
Good.
Adios.